All right, so let's talk about the legacy of the New Deal. The first thing is that the New Deal didn't solve the Great Depression. Why?
I read something in the book. It was like the New Deal didn't solve it, but World War One did solve the Great Depression.
World War II.
Or World War Two. I apologize.
Yeah, that's actually wrong. World War II, although it makes it look like it did, but it really didn't. Okay, and the reason why is because after World War II, the American economy went right back into depression, right? Because they were no longer making those war materials. And what really brought back capitalism was the Bretton Accords that happened. It was an agreement among all the capitalist countries to restructure the economic system of the world, and that's what really brought capitalism back, right? So it really wasn't the war, and again, that's why we don't want to say that war is good for the economy, because it's not. Okay, does that answer your question? Okay, but
Yeah,
then,
yeah, it does.
okay, so now let's ask this question though: if it didn't solve the Great Depression, why didn't it?
Well, I don't think it was really meant to solve it. It was more just meant to like maintain capitalism, sort of just to, like I said, like safety net, like provide stability to it.
Okay, good. And again, we asked the question earlier: did fascism solve the Great Depression, and why didn't it?
Because it's a worldwide going issue.
Exactly, it's a world problem, and so there really wasn't any instrument to solve that problem until after World War II. You follow what I'm saying? It was after World War II that the countries could come together and restructure the economy. All right, you guys got that? Okay, so now, um, if we went from 1933 in the depths of the Great Depression, and we go to 1939 or 1941 when World War II starts, right? And we see that there really hasn't been any increase in the economy, right? Why did the Americans not decide to go for something like Upton Sinclair's socialism, or for some kind of fascism or corporatism? What kept America from the more desperate solutions that other countries adopted?
Wasn't it like the propaganda? Or I mean, I'm not saying this is the only reason, but this aided the reason for Americans not to accept the epic or something like the epic program, and it was because the power that the industries like the movie industry, like Hollywood, the propaganda they put out, um, diluted the perspectives, you could say, of the American citizens.
Okay, and yeah, that's a good argument. The only problem with that argument is that uh, it really puts, well, maybe it's not a good rejoinder to the argument, but it really, people have their own minds, and they should be able to vote. Although propaganda was part of it, but I really not so sure that it was the propaganda of the movie companies as much as it was the propaganda of who?
News outlets.
Well, not necessarily news outlets, but what was the difference um, between Hoover's government and Roosevelt's government in terms of its relation with the people?
Hoover's was very non-interactive, but Roosevelt's was very hands-on.
Very hands-on. And how did he communicate with the people?
Fireside chats.
Exactly. So what we have then is we go from this faraway government that doesn't really relate to me, to this old guy that's sitting in his living room next to the fire, uh, encouraging me, challenging me, right? And what does it do? And he's doing all these different things, right? And what does that do? It creates hope, right? People say, well, yeah, things aren't going so good now, but maybe we know that there's a way out, and we're working on this way out. okay? And we're doing it together, that sort of thing, right? So really, the reason why Americans didn't choose Epic or some other thing like that was because they really believed that Roosevelt was going to be able to pull it off, to bring about a recovery. You guys get what I'm saying? And it was hope. It was really hope that kept capitalism alive in the United States, because, as I mentioned to you guys before, the United States was the only capitalist country left in the world at the beginning of World War II. Right? Questions, comments? Okay. Now, let me just also mention that even though it didn't solve the economic crisis, it did alleviate a lot of suffering, right? It provided money to people that didn't have any money. It provided jobs to people that didn't have any jobs. So there was a lot of goodwill that was created by among the people that it did help, okay? It just didn't solve the problem, all right? Questions, comments?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Was England really not capitalist at the end of the war? Because you said
Well, they
other
had it.
countries like Germany and like Spain, but
Well, they had adopted, socialism in terms of taking over major industries like the railroads and the
oh,
health
okay,
system. Yeah,
gotcha.
that's something that the United States never did do, right?
Okay,
Yeah, although there's some movement towards doing with healthcare. We'll leave that for now anyway. So let's look at some other things, and this is the big criticism as an income redistribution, right? That you're taking money from, I'm going out and working hard for my money and paying taxes, and you're taking those taxes and giving them to other people who aren't working, right? And why should that be? That's not fair, right? Okay, that's socialism. You guys get what I'm saying? Okay, but here's the problem with that argument. I mean, it is true, right? That you take money from people who have money and give it to people who don't have money, but that's always true pretty much in any government, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to have fire departments, and you wouldn't be able to have highways and things like that, public libraries, right? Because I couldn't afford to buy a library. Could you afford to buy a library, right? But altogether, we can make a library. So some people pay more into that library than other people, but we all get to use it equally, right? You get what I'm saying? There's always income redistribution. That doesn't mean it's socialism, right? Or I should say it this way, that socialism isn't it's not an absolute. It's not either the government is doing everything or the government's doing nothing. It's always somewhere in between, right? So the argument in American politics is not over whether or not there should be income redistribution. The argument is always about how much, right? How much income redistribution should there be, right? And so when we frame our arguments in terms of either socialism or capitalism, we're really missing the point, because the United States isn't really either, right? It's somewhere in between. And the arguments between Democrats and Republicans up until more recently have always been how much further to the left or right of the center are you going to get? But it's never very far. It's always, I mean, the range of American politics is tiny compared to world politics, right? World politics goes all the way from total control of the economy to no control at all, right? Okay, and in the United States, it's always somewhere right in the middle. You get what I'm saying? Questions, comments? And that's why it's important to have liberals and conservatives, right? So that you don't go off the rails one way or the other. Does that make sense? Questions, comments? Okay. Gave voice to previously excluded groups like labor and farmers. I already mentioned to you labor. Farmers were helped to a certain extent, but keep in mind that farming was industrializing, and it really never recovered, okay, in terms of, this country being an agrarian country. But labor was supported, and it was helpful to the overall economy to bring the lower classes into the middle classes, right? And I'd say that really since the end of the 1950s, we've seen a real decrease in support for labor, which has contributed to the decline in the middle class. All right, questions, comments about that? And then finally, increased power of the federal government. We see the federal government doing things that people before would never have imagined. Okay, there was only one other time when people had done things that started to happen during the Great Depression, and that was during World War One. Remember when we talked about total war and how the federal government had to organize the economy to fight the war, right? But other than that, after the war was over, everything kind of went back to the way it was until the New Deal. The New Deal then makes the federal government more present in people's lives. All right, questions, comments about this? Okay, but now let me give you a kind of a perspective on that. And I'm going to give you a couple of numbers here. And the first number is that at the beginning of World War II, there were 20,000 federal employees in Washington, D.C., right? At the end of World War II, there were 2 million federal employees in Washington, D.C. So now, which of these two events, the New Deal or World War II, do you think actually created the kind of imperial government that we have today?
The New Deal?
Really? At the beginning of World War II, there were
Can you repeat the numbers again, please?
Right. At the beginning of World War II, there were 20,000 federal workers in Washington, D.C. At the end of World War II, there were 2 million federal workers in Washington, D.C.
Oh, so it would be World War II because of the increase of federal power.
Right. Exactly. And so yeah, the New Deal did create a situation where the federal government had more power than it had ever had before. But the enormous federal government that we have today really was a result of World War II, right? Because once the government has grown to take over certain functions, it never backs off. It's kind of like if you give up some of your freedom for security, when do you get it back? Never. You follow what I'm saying? All right, so we'll just leave it at that. Any questions or comments about any of this?
What did you say? Is that so? What did you say solved the Great Depression? Because you said it wasn't the New Deal nor World War II.
No, it was an arrangement among all of the manufacturing countries after World War II.
Okay, so the arrangement of manufacturing countries after World War II.
Right. And this was actually even outside the UN, right? We'll talk a little bit more about the UN in a couple of weeks, okay? Any other questions, comments? Does that answer your question? I mean, really think about it. Because everybody always says, oh, yeah, it was World War II that ended the Depression.
It's but no, it makes sense. It's like everyone got together and tried to organize an economy that would stabilize more than just themselves.
Okay, yeah. I would say this, that the reason why we could say the context in which we could say that World War II ended the Great Depression was in the context that you read about in The Good War that you're reading for next week, right? And that is that people who weren't working before were now working, right? The problem was that it was only a temporary fix because as soon as the war was over, then there was no need to make airplanes anymore, so they stopped making them, right? And people were out of work again. You see what I'm saying here? Okay, and so it was, even though the American economy was booming during World War II, at the end of World War II, it went right back into depression. Okay, questions?
Yeah,
comments?
That makes sense.
Yeah. All right, any other questions?
Yeah, could you explain how exactly World War II expanded the federal government jobs again? Like what exactly they did? They must have missed that.
Well, they created agencies that oversaw pretty much every aspect of American life because World War II was total war. So in order to organize the country for a total war, and it was much bigger than World War I. Remember, World War I was American troops on the Western Front. Okay, World War II is American troops everywhere in the world, right? And in order to be able to organize that, you need to have a huge bureaucracy, and that so the war actually created that huge bureaucracy.